I think the two questions that are implicit in the title of this session, which are inclusion and its opportunities for inclusion in the current policy context, are not answered by looking at outcomes like this. And so if you look at inclusion, you think of the longer run agenda for inclusion, which is essentially a seat at the table. I mean, this is the the capabilities framework and so on. You really have to ask, what is the current table? What is the table that is created by the current policy environment? And I think one of the things that happened that we just went through is a skip from this is the state of outcome inclusion right now, to these are the opportunities for doing something, while missing that central question that I think is a question for all of you, which is, what is the table that is created by the current policy environment? And this table, I think, if we look at things that are specifically urban policy, this table is essentially something that's created by a process that is outside of the formal representative democratic political arena. And I think that's an important guide. I mean, that people may disagree, and I'd be happy to hear the disagreement, but I think that's an important point to recognize the holdover from the planning process, from the way that investment is channeled through several levels of government, from the comparison to Brazil or South Africa as federal countries, from the relatively political powerlessness and the cap on the political arena of the city. As a venue for responsive politics, or as an arena for responsive politics. It's one of the things that, in planning this workshop, that we had tried to do at IIHS is use workshops like this and use the discussion that's happening today as inputs into forming a research and an advocacy agenda, and an advocacy, a way that research can inform advocacy, a way that advocacy can help us place research and place the outcomes of research. So one of the pieces of that, in order to organize the discussion a little bit, and this is kind of the professor in me coming out, is to have everyone define fairly clearly what they mean by inclusion, and what inclusion means, what they're saying when they're talking about inclusion. I think that's especially important in the context of the introduction that Aro has laid out, is to disentangle three forms of inclusion. One is the outcomes. And I think this introduction and the things that come up most naturally in the debate are the kinds of outcomes that we're seeing. The pictures of the resettlements, the pictures, I mean, that picture of the change in the topography of the city was striking. But to look at inclusion and exclusion only as outcomes, and to look at Brazil, South Africa, China, the comparative examples, looking at these as outcomes, is in some sense the shortest run and the most defeatist way of looking at inclusion as a question. And I think underneath, as we're looking at the next set at the what does inclusion mean, we have to also look at the processes and comparing the processes of what was happening in Brazil, what was happening in South Africa, what's happening in China, and what's happening in India, and be fairly realistic about how is India, what you can't see on a slide and what's harder to see on a slide are the underlying processes and the comparisons of the processes. And on that, just to sort of differ from Aro a little bit, and I think differ from some of the things that have been said in the beginning, is I think in many ways we've been framing in this discussion this morning, I've been struck by how much the process is being framed as one in which it needs to be inclusive politics. So these are political questions. And I think if you look at the policy environment, and in the next few sessions, or in the next few slides, Ara will be talking more about the policy environment. If you look at the policy environment, I think we have to ask ourselves, is this an administrative process, or is this a political process? Those two things have very different implications for a research and an advocacy agenda, because in some sense, the voice that Renana was talking about, the voice in a political process, is very different than the voice in an administrative process. Voice in one sense is, voting and protests and things like that, but voice in another sense is being represented in the data properly. And that's where those two questions, I think, are not necessarily separate. It comes back to what are the processes of inclusion and exclusion. I think having an explicit discussion of, is the current policy environment, which I think it's easy to read as a policy environment where there's a lot more interest in urban, but a lot of it is driven by investment that's coming out of essentially an administrative side and a fiscal side of the government, as opposed to a necessarily political and sort of politically responsive side. And so moving forward just tactically, and what does inclusion mean in current urban policy environment. Looking past the outcomes and looking past remedying the outcomes and looking past the comparison of the outcomes in several countries to start to compare the processes and be very realistic about, is the agenda a political or a representation within the administrative process agenda, is something that in the next few slides it'd be important to keep in the back of our minds.